everyone, this is Ashley from Ashley Plans It All. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you my latest African Queens quilt block quilt that I made for one of my friends' birthday, and I absolutely love it. Looking at this quilt, I can tell that my skills are getting better. My corners on my binding look perfect. This is my best binding situation ever. And I made this quilt in her favorite colors. But before we take a peek at this and see how I made this quilt, let's look at some inspiration. I discovered this pattern back in 2017, and originally I found one photo and could not find a pattern, so my husband helped me draft my own pattern, and it turned out great. I used that pattern, that homemade pattern, quite a few times to make quilts for my mother-in-law, my daughter, my grandmother, my great aunt. It is a go-to quilt pattern for me that I often gift for special women in my family. I love it. It comes together fairly quickly and you can definitely customize it a lot. Eventually, I did stumble upon a few homemade patterns that people made. There was one that was a 10-inch by 10-inch square completed block. The original block is actually a 12.5-inch square. And I did find that online, and the one that I have used more frequently is the 12-inch block, which will be featured in this video. Before I start showing you how I make this block, please know that this is not my pattern, even though I did create one a few years ago, and I do not sell any of the quilts that I make. All of these are gifts that were inspired from a Pinterest post. So with that out the way, let's get on with the sped up tutorial. I am a huge fan of pre-cut fabrics. I collect them, I love them, I hoard them, I just love it. So for this project, I used 2 fat quarter stacks as well as 1 layer cake in snow. I like to cut and organize my fabric into blocks, and to keep all of the blocks organized, I use Wonder Clips. The Wonder Clips are a lifesaver, especially when you get into adding smaller and smaller pieces of different patterns. I mentioned before that this quilt is very customizable, and in all of my examples, all of the African queens in the block were wearing a patterned dress. In the future, I plan on making all of the dresses a white color, and in the background utilizing some fabric from my stash or from my scrap bin and making this a little bit more scrappy. The possibilities for this quilt are truly endless, and I look forward to seeing what you guys do with this quilt block. I do like to cut all of my fabric for a quilt at once, and you can see me working through all of my pattern and solid colored fabrics here for all the African Queen dresses. I do this because A, I want to make sure that I have enough fabric for the project, and B, it makes things a lot simpler when I can just sit at the sewing machine and listen to a great audiobook and piece the quilt blocks together and then get up and press them if I need to, making this a very efficient process. Once I get all the skin pieces cut, I add it to the stack, which contains the dress pieces as well as the white background pieces. Hashtag stay organized. Before moving to the sewing machine, I like to organize my scraps to either store or to use later in the project. For this particular project, I did plan on making a scrappy border and sashing, so I set these aside to use later. Because I stayed so organized, I can easily transition to the sewing machine, and with my pressing mat and hot iron, I was able to use my sewing time efficiently. The instructions for how I piece this quilt block together is on the screen. Keep in mind, when I first discovered this quilt block pattern, I did not have instructions or measurements. I just found a way, and this is how I do this. If you have a better way, then by all means, do you. The piece that you want to trim is the little triangle that is left when you make your diagonal stitch when you combine the hand and the arm sleeve. Even though I have made this quilt and quilt block a few times, I'd still find myself pulling out my seam ripper and fixing my mistakes. You want to make sure that the African Queen is putting her hands into her pockets of her dress and that her hands are not pointing out towards the background. Now that all of my African Queen blocks are complete, it is time to work on the scrappy sashing. To make the scrappy sashing, I made 2.5-inch by 12.5-inch strips to place around each block. Then I cut 2.5-inch squares as the cornerstones of the blocks. Here you can see me pinning the sashing pieces to the queen block. Even though this part of the project is scrappy, I am keeping things very neat and organized, and my future self definitely appreciates it. Here I am back at the sewing machine, and I can easily breeze through this process because everything is pinned and neatly stacked, ready to go.